It wasn't supposed to be something serious, just a distraction, but now it's one of my biggest regrets. It all started 5 months ago. Life seemed perfect on the outside. She had a loving husband, Michael, a stable job, and their young son who brought so much joy to their lives. But behind the scenes, things weren't as ideal as they appeared. Michael had just received a promotion at Google, which should have been cause for celebration. Instead, it created distance between them. Long hours at the office, endless stress, and exhaustion had driven a wedge in their relationship. Her attempts to rekindle the spark in their marriage were met with indifference. Whenever she tried to initiate intimacy, Michael brushed her off, always too tired or too focused on work. It wasn't just the physical distance that grew, but the emotional one as well. She couldn't remember the last time they had a meaningful conversation, let alone a night of passion. Their home, once filled with laughter and love, felt cold and distant. Their son was away at a summer camp, which only made the loneliness at home more intense. It was then that Jay, a client she had been working with for months, entered the picture. Jay wasn't just any client. He was a charming, confident man who had recently started flirting with her in subtle ways. At first, she ignored it. After all, she was married, and it was nothing more than harmless attention. But the lack of affection from Michael left her feeling invisible, and Jay's flirtations, however small, made her feel alive again. What began as simple business lunches to discuss the corporate insurance deal for his fintech company turned into something more. She told herself it was innocent. But deep down, she knew the line between professionalism and personal interest was blurring fast. I tried to maintain the balance between professional and friendly, but deep down, I knew I was failing. One afternoon, during lunch, Jay's attention turned from casual to lingering, his eyes fixating on her in ways that made her feel desired in ways she hadn't felt in months. In that moment, she felt something stir inside her, a longing for attention, affection, and intimacy that had been missing in her life for so long. She knew it was wrong, but the excitement was intoxicating. As her emotional dissatisfaction with Michael grew, so did her attraction to Jay. What had once been a professional relationship now felt like an escape from the reality of her neglected marriage. The guilt started creeping in, but the thrill overshadowed it. Jay was becoming the outlet for all her pent-up frustration, and she was dangerously close to crossing a line she could never uncross. The subtle flirtations, the casual touches, the long stares, everything was leading toward a decision that would change everything. She wasn't sure where it was headed, but in her mind, she justified it as a temporary distraction. Something to fill the emotional void Michael had left behind. But distractions can become dangerous when the heart gets involved. I didn't mean for it to become anything more. It was just supposed to be a distraction. But now, I couldn't deny my feelings for Jay. The cracks in her marriage had begun to show, and for the first time, she was no longer sure if it could be saved. She had always been faithful to Michael, but something about this situation felt inevitable, like she was standing at the edge of a cliff, ready to fall. What started as an emotional escape was becoming a dangerous attraction. Little did she know that the choices she was about to make would lead her down a path of regret, betrayal, and heartbreak. I knew it was wrong to enjoy another man's attention when I was married, but it felt too good to ignore. The emotional void between her and Michael had grown wider with each passing day. Despite her attempts to reconnect with him, nothing worked. Michael's promotion had swallowed him whole, long hours at the office, late nights spent in front of the computer, and a constant stream of meetings left little time for her. The rejection, over and over, stung. She began to resent his excuses and his lack of effort to keep their marriage alive. What used to be their time, filled with warmth and passion, had turned cold and silent. And then there was Jay. He wasn't just a distraction anymore. There was something more brewing under the surface, something she hadn't expected. Their lunches had started to feel less like business meetings and more like dates. Jay, always charming and attentive, seemed to be everything Michael wasn't. He made her laugh, complimented her in ways that made her feel seen and appreciated, and gave her the attention she had been craving. Whenever I was with Jay, I forgot about the loneliness at home. I felt alive again. One afternoon, after a lunch that had been filled with more flirtation than business talk, she spilled water on her blouse. It was a harmless accident, but the way Jay's eyes lingered on her as she fumbled to clean herself up sent a jolt of excitement through her. She caught his gaze, and for the first time, it wasn't subtle anymore. The tension between them was undeniable. She knew what she was doing was dangerous, but she couldn't bring herself to stop. The thrill of the attention, the way Jay looked at her, the way he made her feel, it was like a drug. At home, she felt invisible. With Jay, she felt wanted, desirable, alive. I told myself it was just harmless flirting. But deep down, I knew it was more than that. The next time they met for lunch, things went further than they ever had before. As they sat across from each other, exchanging playful banter, she felt a sudden surge of boldness. She leaned back in her chair, letting her foot graze against his leg under the table. Jay's eyes flicked up to meet hers, a smirk forming on his lips. The tension between them hung thick in the air. It was wrong. She knew it. But in that moment, it didn't matter. She was tired of feeling neglected at home. She was tired of being rejected by Michael. And Jay was everything she had been missing. He was attentive, charming, and clearly interested in her. As their lunch ended, Jay walked her to her car. There was a moment, a brief pause where she could have stopped everything. She could have stepped back and drawn the line. But instead, she leaned in and kissed him. The kiss was electric, filled with the passion she had been missing for so long. In that moment, all her guilt vanished. The only thing she felt was desire. It was a kiss that broke all the rules, a kiss that signaled the start of something she couldn't take back. It was just one kiss, but it was enough to shatter everything. After that, things escalated quickly. She told herself it would only be one time, a mistake she wouldn't repeat. But the pull toward Jay was too strong. They began meeting more frequently, their encounters becoming more intimate. It wasn't just lunch anymore. It was dinners, late-night meetups, and eventually, nights spent together. She had officially crossed the line. Every time she went home to Michael, she felt the weight of her secret pressing down on her. The guilt gnawed at her, but Michael's continued indifference only fueled her justification. He hadn't noticed her slipping away. He hadn't noticed her emotional absence, or even questioned why she was spending more time away from home. His neglect made it easier for her to continue the affair, but deep down, she knew it wouldn't stay hidden forever. I convinced myself that what I was doing wasn't so bad. After all, Michael didn't care. But the guilt was always there, lurking in the back of my mind. As the affair deepened, the thrill of sneaking around with Jay became addictive. Meeting in secret, stolen moments in cars and elevators, it was exciting, dangerous, and unlike anything she had ever experienced with Michael. But the excitement was always followed by a crushing sense of guilt. She knew she was playing with fire, and eventually, it would catch up to her. Jay, for his part, was completely on board with keeping their affair a secret. He knew about Michael and her son, but he didn't push her for more. He was content with the arrangement, which only made it easier for her to justify what they were doing. She had everything she needed, thrills with Jay, stability with Michael, and the love of her son. But how long could she juggle these conflicting worlds before they collided? I was living two lives, one filled with excitement and passion, the other with responsibility and guilt. I knew it couldn't last. But the cracks were already forming, and it was only a matter of time before the entire facade came crashing down. I thought I had everything under control, but the guilt was starting to eat away at me. I knew it was only a matter of time before it all came crashing down. The affair with Jay had quickly spiraled from a distraction to a full-blown escape from the growing emptiness in her marriage. She had told herself it was only temporary, but now, weeks had passed, and her secret life with Jay felt like a twisted version of reality. They met in secret, shared passionate moments that felt thrilling and forbidden, but the weight of the lies she told herself was beginning to take its toll. At home, things with Michael were worse than ever. He barely noticed her anymore, and even when he was home, he was distant, physically there but emotionally absent. The nights of rejection, the quiet dinners, and the coldness between them had become routine. Their home, once a place of warmth, had become a hollow space where neither of them seemed to belong. Their son had returned from summer camp, and she found solace in spending time with him, but every moment with her child only deepened the guilt she carried. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was leading two completely separate lives, one as a devoted mother and wife, and another as a woman tangled in an affair I didn't know how to end. One evening, after weeks of balancing the lie, her carefully constructed world began to unravel. It started with a small slip, a broken phone. She had been on her way to meet Jay for one of their secret lunches when her phone slipped from her hand and fell down a set of stairs. Annoyed, she brushed it off, deciding she would deal with the broken screen later. It didn't seem like a big deal at the time. But as she rushed off to meet Jay, leaving work early for an extended lunch, she had no idea that the damage done wasn't just to her phone. Later that evening, when she returned home at her usual time, everything felt normal. Her son was supposed to be at home with Beth, the nanny, but when she walked in, she immediately noticed something was wrong. Her son wasn't there. Panic surged through her as she demanded to know where he was. Beth quickly explained, he got sick at school today, had a fever, so they rushed him to the hospital. I tried calling you so many times, but... The world around her spun as she realized her broken phone had kept her from hearing the calls. Her son was sick, in the hospital, and she hadn't been there. Worse, Michael had been the one to pick up the call from the school and rush to their son's side. I felt the panic rise inside me. My son needed me, and I had been too busy sneaking around with Jay to even know he was sick. She rushed to the hospital, her mind filled with dread. When she arrived, she saw Michael sitting beside their son's hospital bed, his hand gently stroking the boy's hair as their son animatedly told him stories from school. The sight filled her with guilt, but also with fear. Michael looked up when she entered the room, his expression unreadable. She rushed to her son's side, apologizing profusely for not being there. Her son, innocent and unaware, simply smiled and told her he was feeling better. But the weight of her absence hung heavy between her and Michael. He didn't ask where she had been that afternoon. He didn't need to, not yet. But there was a growing tension in his gaze that told her he suspected something wasn't right. The next few days passed in a blur. Her son recovered, but the guilt over not being there for him lingered. And then, one night, it all came to a head. She had been asleep in her son's room, wanting to be close to him after his illness. It was the middle of the night when she awoke to find Michael standing in the doorway, watching her. For a moment, her heart raced, thinking something was wrong. But the expression on his face was cold, detached. I just got home, he said quietly. I wanted to check on our son before heading to bed. She nodded, unsure of what else to say. But then, without warning, he asked, "Where were you when the school called?" Her stomach dropped. I tried to play it off, blaming the broken phone. But the way he looked at me. I knew he didn't believe me. Michael didn't push further that night, but she could feel the suspicion building. The next day, she tried to go about her routine as usual, work, lunch with Jay, back to the office, then home to her son. But her mind was constantly on Michael, on what he might know. That Friday, everything changed. She walked into the house after work, expecting another quiet evening. But to her shock, Michael was already there, sitting in the living room. He rarely came home before her. She greeted him, forcing a smile, but there was a tension in the air she couldn't ignore. Before she could excuse herself to go take a shower, Michael's calm voice stopped her. "Where were you during your lunch break today?" She froze, the lie catching in her throat. Michael's eyes were locked on hers, and there was no escape this time. He knew something. "I came by your office," he said quietly, "and you weren't there." She felt her heart pounding in her chest, searching for a believable excuse. She mumbled something about a work meeting running late, but the look in Michael's eyes told her he didn't believe a word of it. "I trust you," he whispered, his voice soft but filled with a weight that crushed her. The word stung in a way she hadn't expected. He was telling her he trusted her, while all she could do was lie to his face. The guilt hit me like a tidal wave. I was having an affair, and this man, my husband, still trusted me. I wanted to scream the truth, but I couldn't. That night, in the shower, she broke down. The guilt, the lies, the betrayal, it all became too much. She knew she couldn't keep this up. She had to make a decision: come clean with Michael, end her affair with Jay, or risk losing everything. But every option felt like a loss. For the first time, the consequences of her actions felt real. She was standing on the edge of a cliff, and she wasn't sure if there was any way to avoid the fall. "I thought I could keep living two lives. But when Michael looked at me that night, I knew, he knew." The air between her and Michael had been tense ever since his pointed question about her whereabouts during lunch. The weight of the lies hung over every conversation, every glance they exchanged. She could feel it building, that unspoken knowledge that something was horribly wrong. Michael wasn't the type to confront things head-on. He was quiet, calculated, and patient. But in that patience, she sensed something terrifying. He was waiting for the right moment to strike, to lay everything out. And then, the moment came. It was a Friday evening, much like any other. She had spent the day as usual: work, lunch with Jay, back to the office, and home. But when she walked into the house that evening, she noticed something was different. The house was quiet, too quiet. She could hear her son playing in his room with Beth, the nanny, but Michael was nowhere to be seen. She had barely taken off her coat when Michael emerged from the hallway. His expression was calm, but there was a coldness in his eyes that sent a chill down her spine. He motioned for her to sit down in the living room, and she obeyed, her heart racing in her chest. She knew what was coming. Michael sat down across from her, a neutral expression on his face. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the silence between them heavy with anticipation. Finally, Michael broke the silence. "I've been thinking a lot lately," he said, his voice measured and calm. "About us. About the way things have been." She felt her breath catch, her hands fidgeting in her lap. There was no way to know exactly how much he knew, but the fear that had been simmering for weeks was boiling over. "I know something's been going on," Michael continued. "And I didn't want to believe it at first. I told myself it was just my imagination, that I was being paranoid." Her heart pounded louder in her ears, her throat dry as she prepared for what was coming next. "But then I started watching. Paying attention. I saw you, you know." She froze, her eyes widening. "Saw me? What do you mean?" Michael reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his phone. With a few swipes, he held the screen toward her, and her stomach dropped. There, on the screen, were pictures. Pictures of her and Jay, together. In one, she was getting into Jay's car. In another, they were kissing in a parking lot. She felt the blood drain from her face, her hands trembling as she stared at the evidence of her betrayal. "I didn't want to confront you like this," Michael said, his voice cold now. "But I couldn't stand lying to myself any longer. I saw you with him, multiple times. How long has this been going on?" The world around me collapsed. There was no way out, no more lies to tell. He knew everything. She opened her mouth to speak, but the words wouldn't come. There was no denying it now. Michael had seen everything. All she could do was admit the truth, and even that felt like a hollow gesture. It wasn't supposed to happen," she stammered, tears welling up in her eyes. I don't know how it started. I didn't mean for it to go this far. Michael's face remained emotionless, his eyes hard as stone. How long? She took a deep breath, her voice barely above a whisper. A few months. Michael leaned back in his chair, his jaw clenched as he absorbed her confession. The silence between them was suffocating, and she felt the weight of her actions crushing her. I was going to end it, she blurted out, desperate to salvage whatever dignity she had left. I was going to stop it. I never wanted to hurt you, Michael. He let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. You didn't want to hurt me. You've been lying to me for months. Sneaking around, betraying me, and you're telling me you didn't want to hurt me? Tears streamed down her face now, her heart aching as she realized just how deeply she had wounded him. She wanted to reach out, to apologize, to explain, but what could she say? What could possibly make this right? I was a terrible wife, but it hurt so much to see the man I once loved looking at me like I was nothing. Michael's eyes bore into hers, cold and unrelenting. I trusted you, he said, his voice low and filled with anger. I trusted you to be my partner, to be the mother of our son. And you threw it all away for him. She shook her head, sobbing. It wasn't like that. I was lonely, Michael. You were never around, and I. Don't you dare blame this on me, he snapped, his voice rising for the first time. I was working hard for this family, for you, for our son. I was trying to give us everything we ever wanted. She flinched at his words, the truth of her own selfishness cutting deeper than she could bear. Michael stood up, pacing the room, his anger palpable. I wasn't perfect, but I never cheated on you. I never gave up on this family. I wanted to scream, to tell him that I was sorry, that I never meant for this to happen. But the damage was done. After a long silence, Michael stopped pacing and turned to her, his expression unreadable. I've already made my decision. Her heart sank. What do you mean? He reached into his jacket again, this time pulling out an envelope. Her hands trembled as he handed it to her. She knew what it was before she even opened it. Divorce papers. I had these drawn up after I saw you with him, Michael said, his voice devoid of emotion. It's over. I don't want to hear any more excuses. You destroyed this marriage. Her fingers shook as she opened the envelope and stared at the papers inside. But the worst part wasn't the divorce, it was the custody request. Michael was asking for full custody of their son. No, she whispered, her voice breaking. You can't take him from me. Michael's eyes narrowed. I can, and I will. I've spoken to a lawyer. Given the evidence of your affair, I have every right to ask for full custody. Our son deserves better than a mother who sneaks around behind his father's back. She shook her head, tears streaming down her face. Please, Michael. I can't lose him. He's everything to me. He stared at her, unflinching. You should have thought about that before you decided to destroy this family. I had hurt him so deeply, and now I was losing everything. My marriage, my son, my entire life was slipping through my fingers. Desperation clawed at her as she tried to reason with him, to beg him to reconsider, but Michael was firm. He handed her the papers and told her she had 2 days to sign them. If she refused, he warned, he would make sure their son knew the truth about what she had done. The threat left her reeling, and she realized just how far Michael was willing to go to protect their son, and to make her pay. I was trapped. Either I signed the papers and lost my son, or I fought back and risked him hating me forever. In that moment, she knew. She had made a terrible mistake, and now she was paying the price. Her life was falling apart, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. It wasn't just about losing my marriage, it was about losing my son, my world. I couldn't let that happen. The divorce papers sat on the kitchen counter, an ominous reminder of how far things had unraveled. She had barely slept since that confrontation with Michael. The look in his eyes, the coldness in his voice, it all played on a loop in her mind. The reality of what she had done hit her like a tidal wave. Her marriage was over. But what hurt the most was the very real possibility that she could lose her son. In the days following Michael's ultimatum, she had tried to gather herself, but the weight of her guilt and fear made it nearly impossible to think straight. She couldn't imagine a life where she wasn't with her son every day, tucking him in at night, hearing him laugh, watching him grow. Losing him was not an option. She knew that Michael was furious, but the thought of him having full custody was unbearable. She had made mistakes, but she loved her son deeply, and she wasn't about to give him up without a fight. I couldn't lose him. He was everything. My whole world. I had to fight back, even if it meant facing the wreckage I'd created. She decided it was time to speak to a lawyer of her own. She couldn't sit idly by while Michael took everything from her. She had made a terrible mistake, but she wasn't a bad mother. The thought of Michael using the affair to take her son away was something she couldn't live with. But walking into a lawyer's office, explaining the details of her situation, made everything feel painfully real. Her lawyer, Megan, listened intently as she explained what had happened, from the affair to the divorce papers Michael had served her. Megan didn't sugarcoat things. She told her up front that fighting for custody after having an affair would be an uphill battle, especially with the evidence Michael had. But Megan was also reassuring. There was a way forward, though it wouldn't be easy. We can build a case, Megan said, her tone firm but compassionate. You've been a good mother. We can prove that. The affair complicates things, but it doesn't erase everything else you've done for your son. We'll fight for joint custody. Her heart sank a little at the words, joint custody. She had always imagined having her son with her full time, but the reality was that Michael had just as much right to fight for him. Even if she fought with everything she had, she couldn't guarantee she'd win. But she wasn't about to roll over and give up. Megan explained the process, outlining the steps they would need to take, gathering evidence, preparing for a custody hearing, and ensuring that they painted a full picture of her life as a mother. It would be messy. It would be hard. But there was a chance. I didn't care how hard it would be. I had to fight for him. I wasn't about to lose my son over a mistake I could never take back. Over the next few weeks, the tension between her and Michael was unbearable. They barely spoke, and when they did, it was through cold, clipped sentences. Every time she saw him, her chest tightened with a mix of guilt and dread. She hated the distance between them, but she knew it was of her own making. One evening, as she was tucking her son into bed, Michael appeared in the doorway, watching them. She could feel his eyes on her, and for a moment, her heart ached for the way things used to be. She wished she could turn back time, undo everything, and return to the family they once had. But that wasn't possible. Can we talk? Michael asked quietly, once their son had fallen asleep. She nodded, though her stomach churned. They made their way to the kitchen, the house silent around them. Michael leaned against the counter, his arms crossed, his face unreadable. I know we've both been speaking with lawyers, he said, his voice steady. I don't want this to get uglier than it has to. She swallowed hard, her mind racing. I don't want that either, she replied softly. There was a long pause before Michael spoke again. I know you love our son. I know you've been a good mother. But what you did, it's changed everything. I don't trust you anymore. And I don't know if I ever will. His words cut through her, sharp and brutal. She blinked back tears, unable to respond. He wasn't wrong. She had broken his trust, shattered the foundation of their family. But losing his trust didn't mean she deserved to lose her son. I don't want to keep him from you, Michael continued, his tone softening slightly. But I also don't want to lose him. He's all I have left. We were both broken, both afraid of losing the one thing we loved more than anything in the world. Our son. For the first time in weeks, she saw a glimpse of the man she had fallen in love with. Michael wasn't just angry, he was hurt. He was scared. And so was she. "I'm not going to sign the papers asking for full custody," Michael said, surprising her. "But I want joint custody. I want him to spend half his time with me. That's non-negotiable." Her breath caught in her throat. Joint custody. It wasn't ideal. It wasn't what she had dreamed of, but it was something. It was a way to stay in her son's life, to be there for him. And, in a way, it was a small olive branch from Michael, a recognition that, despite everything, she still mattered as a mother. She nodded slowly, the weight of the moment settling over her. "Okay," she whispered. "Joint custody." The battle wasn't over. They would still have to go through the legal process, still have to work out the details of the arrangement. But for the first time in what felt like forever, there was a glimmer of hope. Over the next few days, she worked closely with Megan, preparing for the custody hearing. They gathered evidence of her involvement in her son's life, character statements from friends and family, and documented her efforts to be a good mother despite the affair. It was exhausting, emotionally draining, but it was necessary. I was determined to fight for my son. He was the only thing that mattered now. The day of the custody hearing arrived, and she felt a pit of anxiety in her stomach. Sitting in the courtroom, facing Michael across the table, was harder than she could have ever imagined. He looked so different now, colder, more distant than she had ever seen him. They had once been so close, and now they were on opposite sides of a courtroom, fighting over their son. The hearing was tense, each lawyer presenting their case, each argument tearing at her heart. Michael's lawyer didn't hold back, emphasizing her affair and the way it had damaged their marriage. But Megan was prepared, countering with evidence of her involvement as a mother, her dedication to her son, and her willingness to take responsibility for her mistakes. In the end, the judge ruled in favor of joint custody. It wasn't a victory, but it wasn't a defeat either. It was a compromise, a painful, necessary compromise. I had lost so much, but I hadn't lost my son. And for that, I was grateful. Walking out of the courthouse, she felt a strange mix of emotions. Relief, sadness, guilt, and hope all swirled together. She knew that things would never be the same, that her relationship with Michael was irreparably damaged. But she still had her son, and that was enough to keep her going. As she drove home, she thought about the road ahead. Co-parenting with Michael would be difficult, especially after everything that had happened. But she was ready to face it. She had made her mistakes, but she wasn't going to let them define her forever. There was still a long way to go, still more healing to be done. But for the first time in a long time, she felt like she had a chance to rebuild, not just her relationship with her son, but with herself. I had fought for my son and won. But what came next was harder than I ever imagined. The custody battle had ended, but the aftermath of the confrontation with Michael still hung heavy in the air. The legal decision meant that their son would spend half his time with her and half with Michael. It was the best possible outcome under the circumstances, but as she faced the reality of co-parenting with the man whose heart she had broken, it became clear that this was only the beginning of a new and difficult chapter. Her first weekend alone with their son was bittersweet. It was just the two of them, something she had wanted so desperately during the custody fight, but now, she couldn't shake the feeling of emptiness that lingered after Michael's absence. She tried to focus on her son, to throw herself into their time together, making pancakes and going to the park, but in the quiet moments, the guilt gnawed at her. He looked at me with such innocence, such love. How could I have let everything fall apart like this? The hardest part wasn't the time she spent with her son, it was the time she didn't. Dropping him off at Michael's place for the first time was more painful than she had imagined. Michael barely spoke to her, his eyes cold and distant as he took their son's hand and led him inside without so much as a glance in her direction. She had to force a smile, fighting back tears as her son waved goodbye to her from the doorstep. The drive back to her empty house was unbearable. The silence was deafening, and for the first time in months, she had no distractions, no affair, no custody battle, nothing to keep her mind from wandering to the guilt she had buried deep inside. She had spent so long fighting to keep her son in her life, but now that he was gone, even for a few days, she couldn't escape the loneliness. I had my son. I had fought for him and won. But the price I paid for my mistakes still weighed on me. I had lost so much. Co-parenting with Michael was far from easy. There was no warmth between them, no small talk, no smiles. Each handover felt like a business transaction. She could see the bitterness in his eyes every time they crossed paths, a reminder of the betrayal that had shattered their marriage. He was civil, but nothing more. They communicated strictly about their son, schedules, school events, doctor's appointments, but nothing beyond that. Her son, still too young to fully grasp the situation, seemed to adjust well to the new arrangement. He loved spending time with both of his parents, unaware of the tension that simmered between them. For him, the world was still filled with innocence, and she was grateful for that. But she knew the questions would come eventually, the day when he would ask why mommy and daddy didn't live together anymore. The first time that question came, she wasn't prepared. It was a rainy Sunday afternoon, and her son had just returned from a weekend with Michael. He was playing with his toys in the living room when he suddenly looked up and asked, "Mommy, why can't Daddy stay here with us?" The question hit her like a punch to the gut. She froze, unsure of what to say, her heart aching as she realized there was no easy answer. Her son was too young to understand the complexities of what had happened, too innocent to know the truth about why their family had broken apart. How do you explain something so painful to someone so innocent? She knelt beside him, gently taking his hand in hers. "Daddy and we're living in different houses now," she said softly, her voice thick with emotion. "But that doesn't change how much we both love you. You're so special to both of us, and that will never change." Her son nodded, seemingly satisfied with the answer, but the look in his eyes told her he didn't fully understand. How could he? He was just a child, caught in the middle of something far too complicated for him to grasp. As time passed, the routine of co-parenting became more familiar. She and Michael developed a system: alternate weekends, split holidays, shared responsibilities for school events and parent-teacher conferences. On the surface, it was functional, but underneath, the tension never fully went away. Every interaction with Michael felt like a reminder of her mistakes, a constant tug of guilt that she couldn't escape. And then, there was Jay. She hadn't spoken to him since the confrontation with Michael. After everything had come to light, she had cut off all contact. Jay had respected her decision, never pushing for more or trying to keep the affair going. He had been a temporary escape, a distraction, but in the end, he wasn't part of the life she was trying to rebuild. One day, weeks after the custody battle had settled, she found herself walking through the park with her son when she spotted Jay sitting on a bench in the distance. For a moment, their eyes met, and the flood of memories came rushing back. There was no anger in his gaze, no resentment, just a sad understanding of what had happened between them. She quickly looked away, focusing on her son, but the encounter stayed with her for the rest of the day. Jay had been a chapter in her life, one that had closed, but seeing him reminded her of the choices she had made, the consequences she was still dealing with. Seeing him again was like reopening a wound I had been trying to heal. He was a reminder of the person I had been, the mistakes I had made. It took everything in her to not reach out, to not slip back into the comfort of his attention. But she knew better now. Jay wasn't part of her future, he was part of her past, a past she was working hard to leave behind. As the weeks turned into months, she slowly began to rebuild. It wasn't easy, and there were days when the weight of everything she had lost felt unbearable. But she found strength in her son, in the time they spent together, and in the hope that maybe, one day, she could forgive herself for what had happened. Her relationship with Michael remained strained, but they managed to coexist for the sake of their son. There were no heated arguments, no more confrontations, just a mutual understanding that they had to make the best of the situation for their child. We had both lost so much, but we still had our son. And that was enough to keep going. Over time, the loneliness that had once consumed her began to fade. She focused on her work, on being the best mother she could be, and slowly, piece by piece, she started to find herself again. She wasn't the same woman she had been before the affair. She was older, wiser, and painfully aware of the consequences of her actions. But she had learned something important along the way: she could rebuild, she could heal, and she could move forward. The road ahead was still uncertain, and there were no easy answers. But for the first time in a long time, she felt like she had a chance at something better, something real. I thought the hardest part was losing my marriage, but learning to forgive myself has been a far greater challenge. Months had passed since the custody agreement was settled, and while she had begun to rebuild her life on the surface, the emotional scars still ran deep. Co-parenting had become part of her new normal, and the time she spent with her son was a constant source of joy and comfort. But when her son wasn't with her, the silence and loneliness crept in, reminding her of the life she had shattered. The first few months after the divorce were a blur of routine. She had thrown herself into work, into being the best mother she could be, but there were moments, quiet, dark moments, where the guilt and regret seemed overwhelming. The cracks in her marriage with Michael had widened into an unbridgeable chasm, and no amount of wishing could bring back what they had once shared. She had learned to accept that. But what she hadn't yet learned to accept was herself. I couldn't escape the weight of what I'd done. Every day, I tried to move forward, but it felt like I was dragging the past with me. Every time she saw Michael, every brief interaction they had while handing over their son, she felt the sting of the choices she'd made. His coldness, his indifference, it was a constant reminder of her betrayal. And even though the worst of the storm had passed, she knew there was still a long way to go before either of them could fully move on. One evening, after a particularly tough day at work, she sat alone on her couch, her son already fast asleep in his room. The house was quiet, and for the first time in weeks, she allowed herself to confront the emotions she had been trying to avoid. She thought back to the affair with Jay, the way it had started, and how it had spiraled into something she couldn't control. What had she been looking for? Why had she made those choices, knowing how much was at stake? The truth was complicated. She had felt invisible in her marriage for so long, and Jay had given her something Michael hadn't. He had made her feel alive again. But now, sitting alone in the silence, she realized how fleeting and shallow that feeling had been. It wasn't real. What she had sacrificed for that fleeting moment of validation was far greater than she had ever imagined. I had to face it. What I did wasn't just a mistake, it was a choice. And that choice had consequences. I couldn't keep running from it. The first step toward forgiveness, her therapist had told her, was acknowledging the pain she had caused, not just to others, but to herself. She had been avoiding that for months, burying her emotions under the weight of her responsibilities. But now, sitting in the stillness of her empty home, she realized it was time to confront the truth. Her therapist had encouraged her to write a letter, to Michael, to herself, or even to Jay. It didn't matter if she sent it. The act of writing, of putting her thoughts and emotions into words, would help her process everything. She had avoided doing it for weeks, afraid of what might come to the surface, but now she felt ready. She sat at the dining room table, a blank sheet of paper in front of her, and took a deep breath. The words came slowly at first, but then, like a floodgate opening, everything spilled out. She wrote about the loneliness she had felt in her marriage, about the choices she had made and how much she regretted them. She wrote about Michael, about the love they had once shared, and how much she missed the way things used to be before everything fell apart. She wrote about her son, the one bright spot in the darkness, and how much she wanted to be the best mother she could be for him. I wrote until there was nothing left to say. The guilt, the pain, the regret, it all poured out onto the page. When she finished, she sat back and looked at what she had written. It was raw, painful, but it was the truth. For the first time, she had allowed herself to confront her feelings head-on, without distraction. The letter was for her eyes only, but writing it had lifted a weight off her chest that she hadn't realized she was carrying. The next day, she felt lighter, more focused. There was still a long road ahead, but she had taken the first step toward forgiveness, toward letting go of the guilt that had been holding her back. She continued her therapy, working through the layers of pain and regret that had built up over the past year. Slowly, she began to understand that forgiving herself wasn't about excusing what she had done. It was about recognizing her humanity, accepting that she had made a terrible mistake, and learning how to move forward without letting it define her. Her sessions with her therapist helped her explore the reasons behind the affair, the emotional void that had led her down that path, and how to prevent it from happening again in the future. She wasn't that woman anymore, the one who sought validation in the wrong places. She had grown, learned from her mistakes, and was determined to rebuild her life on a stronger foundation. Forgiveness wasn't about forgetting. It was about accepting the past, learning from it, and finding a way to move forward. As the weeks passed, she noticed small changes in herself. She smiled more. She laughed with her son more freely. The weight of her past didn't feel as heavy anymore, and she began to reconnect with the things that brought her joy, reading, painting, and spending time with close friends. One weekend, she had a rare conversation with Michael. It was short, but civil. They talked about their son's school project and plans for his birthday. For the first time in months, the interaction didn't feel strained. There was no warmth, no hint of reconciliation, but there was respect. And that, she realized, was a step forward. We would never be what we once were. But we could be better, for our son, and for ourselves. As her relationship with Michael stabilized, she found herself thinking about what the future might hold. She had been so focused on surviving, on getting through each day, that she hadn't allowed herself to think beyond that. But now, for the first time, she felt ready to dream again. Her therapist encouraged her to set small goals for herself, things she could work toward that had nothing to do with the past, with Michael, or with the affair. She started by focusing on her career, taking on new projects at work and investing more energy into her personal growth. She also began spending more time with friends, re-establishing connections that had faded during the chaos of the past year. Her best friend, Grace, had been a constant source of support, but she had also kept her distance, knowing that healing had to come from within. Now, they began meeting more regularly, talking about everything from work to parenting, to the possibilities of new beginnings. I started to see a future again, not one defined by my mistakes, but one built on the lessons I'd learned. The thought of dating again had crossed her mind, but it still felt too soon. She wasn't ready, and she didn't want to rush into anything. For now, her focus was on herself, on being the best mother she could be, and on continuing her journey towards self-forgiveness. I was still healing, but for the first time in a long time, I wasn't afraid of the future. I had made mistakes, but I was learning from them. And that was enough. Healing wasn't a straight path. Some days, I felt stronger. Other days, the weight of the past pulled me down. But I kept going. The months after her letter and therapy sessions marked the beginning of a new chapter in her life. The pain of the affair, the divorce, and the custody battle no longer defined her daily existence. She had been learning, slowly but surely, to forgive herself and rebuild her life one step at a time. But what came next was the process of rediscovery. Who was she now, after everything that had happened? Her relationship with Michael remained civil but distant. They had established a routine for co-parenting that worked well enough. They communicated about their son, attended his school events together, and made sure he felt as though his life hadn't completely fallen apart. But beyond the surface, there was little left between them. The love they had shared was a distant memory, and the pain of the betrayal still lingered beneath their interactions. But as the tension between her and Michael softened, the walls she had built around herself began to lower. She felt herself starting to open up again, not just to Michael or her son, but to the possibility of a new life. She no longer felt like the woman who had made terrible mistakes, the woman who had destroyed her family. She had faced her demons, and now, she was beginning to feel something she hadn't allowed herself in a long time: hope. There was no rush. I didn't need to prove anything to anyone. I was just learning to live again, one small step at a time. Her therapy sessions continued, and her therapist encouraged her to explore the things that made her feel alive again, things she had once loved but had pushed aside during the chaos of her marriage and affair. She began painting again, a hobby she had all but forgotten in recent years. The act of creating something from nothing, of pouring her emotions onto a blank canvas, became a form of therapy in itself. She found solace in the quiet moments, painting late into the night after her son had gone to bed. There was something freeing about it, something that allowed her to express what she couldn't put into words. Her paintings weren't masterpieces, but they didn't need to be. They were her own, and that was enough. In addition to painting, she also began reconnecting with friends. Grace, who had been a steady support throughout the entire ordeal, invited her to join a group of friends for a weekend retreat in the countryside. At first, she hesitated. It had been so long since she had done something for herself, something purely for enjoyment. But Grace insisted, and eventually, she agreed. The weekend away proved to be exactly what she needed. Surrounded by nature and friends, she felt a sense of freedom she hadn't experienced in years. The group spent their days hiking, cooking together, and talking late into the night. It was during one of these conversations, while sitting around a bonfire, that she found herself opening up in a way she hadn't expected. I was afraid to let anyone see the real me, the woman who had made so many mistakes. But that weekend, I learned that my past didn't have to define me. She shared pieces of her story with the group, and to her surprise, they didn't judge her. Instead, they listened with compassion and understanding. It was a turning point for her, realizing that she wasn't alone, that everyone had their own struggles and mistakes, and that she was worthy of love and connection, despite everything. After the retreat, she returned home feeling lighter, more centered. There were still challenges, of course. Co-parenting with Michael continued to have its difficulties, and there were days when the weight of the past felt overwhelming. But for the first time in a long time, she believed she could handle it. She had built the tools she needed to move forward, and she wasn't as afraid of the future anymore. Her relationship with her son grew stronger as well. He was getting older now, beginning to ask more questions about the changes in their family, and she was careful with how she answered. She wanted to protect him from the pain of what had happened but also be honest enough to help him understand. One evening, as they sat together watching a movie, he turned to her and asked, "Mom, why don't you and Dad live together anymore?" The question, though inevitable, still hit her with a wave of emotion. She had been preparing for this moment for months, but it didn't make it any easier. She gently paused the movie, pulling him into her lap, and spoke softly. "Sometimes," she said, "people love each other, but they grow apart. It doesn't mean they stop caring about each other or stop loving their family. Your dad and I both love you very much. But we had to make some changes so we could be better parents to you." Her son nodded slowly, processing her words. "But you're still friends, right?" She smiled, though it was bittersweet. "We'll always be a part of each other's lives because of you. And that's what's most important." The conversation reminded her of how far she had come. She had spent so long fearing this moment, fearing what it would mean to explain the broken pieces of her marriage to her son. But now that it had happened, she realized that it wasn't as frightening as she had imagined. They had made it through the worst, and they were still standing. "For the first time, I saw the strength in what we had built. We weren't the same family we used to be, but we were still a family." As the months continued, she allowed herself to dream again. She began thinking about the possibility of dating, not to fill a void, but because she had reached a point where she felt whole enough to share her life with someone again. It wasn't about finding a replacement for what she had lost with Michael, it was about moving forward on her own terms. There were a few dates, casual, nothing serious, but it was a start. She didn't feel the rush to jump into something new. Instead, she was content with the idea of taking her time, of getting to know herself again before letting anyone else in. Her career flourished as well. With the emotional weight of the past year lifting, she found herself more engaged at work, more willing to take on new challenges. Her colleagues noticed the change, commenting on how much more confident and focused she seemed. She wasn't just surviving anymore, she was thriving. I had spent so long trying to prove myself to others. But now, I was doing it for me. And that made all the difference. One afternoon, after a particularly successful meeting, she received a text from Grace, "Coffee? Let's celebrate." She smiled, realizing just how far she had come. The woman she was now, strong, resilient, hopeful, wasn't the same woman who had made those painful mistakes. But those mistakes had shaped her, had taught her valuable lessons about love, loss, and forgiveness. As she sipped her coffee with Grace, laughing and reminiscing, she felt a sense of contentment she hadn't experienced in years. Life wasn't perfect. There were still hard days, still moments of doubt. But she had found a way to rebuild, to rediscover the pieces of herself she thought she had lost. And as she looked toward the future, she knew one thing for certain, she was ready for whatever came next. Healing doesn't happen all at once. It's a slow, steady journey, but with every step, I'm finding my way forward. Months had passed, and the slow, steady process of rebuilding her life continued. The pain of the past hadn't disappeared, but it no longer controlled her. She had made peace with her mistakes and accepted that she could never undo what had happened. But she had learned from them, and with each passing day, she grew stronger, more confident in the woman she was becoming. Her focus remained on her son, who was thriving despite the changes in their family. Their bond had deepened over time, and she cherished every moment they spent together. The questions about the divorce still came now and then, but she was more prepared for them. Each time, she answered with patience and honesty, giving him the reassurance that, no matter what, both of his parents loved him deeply. We weren't the family we used to be, but we were still a family. And that's what mattered most. Her relationship with Michael had stabilized as well. The icy distance that had once defined their interactions had begun to thaw, and while they would never go back to what they once were, there was a mutual respect between them now. They communicated more easily about their son, attending school events and birthday parties together, both determined to make the co-parenting arrangement as seamless as possible for him. One afternoon, after a parent-teacher conference, Michael approached her in the parking lot. It was the first time they had spoken alone in months. She felt a flicker of nervousness as he walked toward her, unsure of what he wanted to say. "Hey," he began, his voice softer than she remembered. "I just wanted to say, you're doing a great job with him. Our son. I can see how happy he is with you." Her heart skipped a beat at the unexpected compliment. She nodded, a small smile tugging at her lips. "Thanks. You're doing great, too. He loves his time with you." They stood there for a moment, an awkward silence between them, before Michael spoke again. "I know things didn't end well between us, Anne. I don't think we'll ever be able to fix what's broken. But I just want you to know, I don't hold any grudges anymore. I'm moving on, and I hope you can, too." The words hit her like a wave of relief. For so long, she had carried the weight of their broken marriage on her shoulders, fearing that Michael's resentment would last forever. But hearing him say those words, words of closure, gave her a sense of peace she hadn't realized she needed. "For the first time, I felt like we could both move forward. Not as a couple, but as two people who shared a love for our son." That conversation marked a turning point. She no longer felt the need to avoid Michael or tiptoe around their shared responsibilities. They had both made their peace with what had happened, and though the pain of their past would always linger, it no longer defined their relationship. It was a fragile truce, but it was a step in the right direction. With that burden lifted, she found herself opening up to new possibilities. She had spent so long rebuilding the pieces of her life that had shattered, but now, she was ready to move beyond that. She didn't want to just survive anymore, she wanted to thrive. Her career had flourished over the past few months, and she had begun to take on more leadership responsibilities at work. Her confidence had grown, and her colleagues noticed the change. She was no longer the quiet, uncertain woman who had been weighed down by personal turmoil. She was focused, driven, and ready to take on new challenges. Outside of work, her social life had expanded as well. She and Grace continued their monthly meetups, and she had started to reconnect with old friends she had lost touch with during the darkest times of her marriage and affair. One of those friends, Olivia, invited her to a charity event that she was organizing, a gala to raise funds for a local children's hospital. At first, she was hesitant. The idea of attending a formal event, mingling with strangers, felt overwhelming. But Grace encouraged her to go, and after some thought, she decided it was time to step out of her comfort zone. I had spent so long hiding from the world. It was time to start living again. The night of the gala arrived, and as she walked into the elegant ballroom, she felt a mixture of nerves and excitement. The room was filled with people, some she recognized, others she didn't, but for the first time in a long time, she didn't feel out of place. She had earned her spot here, not just as a guest but as someone who had overcome her own battles and was ready to embrace the future. As the evening progressed, she found herself chatting with different people, enjoying the lively conversation and the sense of being part of something bigger. It was refreshing to be surrounded by new faces, people who didn't know her past or the mistakes she had made. Here, she wasn't defined by her old life. She was simply herself. Toward the end of the night, as she stood by the bar sipping a glass of wine, she noticed a man approaching her. He was tall, with an easy smile and a relaxed demeanor. He introduced himself as Luke, a colleague of Olivia's, and they struck up a conversation about the event, the charity, and their shared interests. There was no pressure, no hidden agenda. It was just a simple, light-hearted conversation. But something about Luke's warmth and genuine interest in her caught her attention. They talked for the rest of the evening, and by the time the night ended, he had asked if he could see her again. For the first time, she said yes. I wasn't looking for anything. But maybe, just maybe, it was time to open myself up to something new. In the weeks that followed, she and Luke began seeing each other casually. She wasn't rushing into anything, there was no need to. They enjoyed each other's company, and for the first time in years, she felt excited about the possibility of something new. It wasn't the same as before. She wasn't looking to fill a void or escape her life. She was ready for something real, something built on trust and honesty. As she navigated this new relationship, she realized just how much she had changed. She was no longer the woman who had been consumed by guilt and regret. She had grown, healed, and found a new sense of purpose. Her life was far from perfect, but it was hers, messy, complicated, and beautiful in its own way. I had spent so long punishing myself for the past. But now, I was ready to embrace the future. The road ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time, she felt confident in where it might lead. She had learned that healing wasn't about erasing the past but about accepting it, learning from it, and using those lessons to build a better future. Her son was thriving, her relationship with Michael had stabilized, and she had found a sense of peace within herself that she never thought possible. She wasn't afraid of the future anymore. She welcomed it with open arms, ready for whatever it might bring. I had spent so long waiting for life to get better. Now, I was living it, fully, freely, and on my own terms. A year had passed since that dark period when her life had unraveled. The divorce, the affair, the battle over custody, all of it felt like a distant memory now. It wasn't that she had forgotten those painful moments. She never could. But they no longer defined her. They had shaped her, yes, but they weren't the whole story. The chapters that followed had been about rebuilding, rediscovering, and reclaiming her life. Her son was thriving, happy and full of energy. His resilience astounded her, and as she watched him grow, she marveled at how their love for him had remained a constant through all the changes. She and Michael had found a rhythm as co-parents that worked for them. It wasn't perfect, but it was functional, and their shared commitment to their son was all that mattered. They were no longer enemies, and though they would never be close again, there was a quiet understanding between them. The resentment had faded, replaced by respect for the roles they now played in their son's life. She had also allowed herself to move on emotionally. Her relationship with Luke had developed slowly, organically. What began as casual dates had evolved into something more meaningful, but this time, she was taking things at her own pace. There was no rush, no urgency to fill a void. She was whole on her own, and Luke respected that. He had become a steady, comforting presence in her life, and for the first time, she felt like she was truly capable of loving again, without the baggage, without the guilt. One evening, as she sat on her back porch watching the sunset, Luke by her side, she reflected on how far she had come. It was a rare, quiet moment, one where everything seemed to fall into place. The chaos that had once consumed her life was now just a memory, and in its place was a sense of peace and fulfillment she hadn't thought possible. For so long, I had been waiting for life to give me permission to be happy. Now, I realized I didn't need permission. I was enough. She had learned so much over the past year. Not just about forgiveness, but about resilience. About how life could be rebuilt, piece by piece, even after everything had fallen apart. She had discovered strength she didn't know she had, and while the journey had been painful, it had also been necessary. Her career was flourishing, and with her new sense of confidence, she had taken on more leadership roles at work. She no longer questioned her worth or her abilities. She knew what she brought to the table, and she wasn't afraid to claim her space. Her colleagues had noticed the shift in her, commenting on how much more assertive and sure of herself she seemed. Her social circle had grown as well. She and Grace had become closer than ever, their friendship a steady source of support and laughter through it all. They still met regularly, going on weekend trips or simply enjoying coffee together. But she had also reconnected with other friends, finding joy in the small moments of shared experiences. It wasn't that life was perfect, there were still challenges, still moments of doubt or stress. But those moments no longer overwhelmed her. She had learned to weather the storms, to trust that they would pass, and that she was strong enough to handle whatever came her way. I had once believed that I was defined by my mistakes, by the things I had done wrong. But now, I knew I was defined by what I had done to make things right. The relationship with her son remained at the center of her world. Their bond had only deepened with time, and she cherished every moment they spent together. Watching him grow into his own person was one of the greatest joys of her life, and knowing that she had fought for him, that she had made sure she remained a central figure in his life, gave her a sense of pride she hadn't felt in years. One afternoon, as they played together in the park, her son asked her a question that made her pause. "Mom," he said, looking up at her with those wide, curious eyes, "are you happy?" The simplicity of the question took her by surprise. For so long, happiness had seemed like something elusive, something just out of reach. But as she looked down at her son, felt the warmth of the sun on her face, and thought about the life she had rebuilt, she realized that the answer was yes. She smiled, pulling him close and kissing the top of his head. "Yes," she said softly. "I'm happy." And she meant it. Happiness wasn't something that just happened. It was something I chose, every day. And finally, I was choosing it for myself. As the seasons changed and another year began, she found herself thinking less about the past and more about the future. There were still challenges ahead, still uncertainties. But she no longer feared them. She had faced the worst, and she had survived. More than that, she had thrived. Luke had become a steady part of her life, and while she was content with where things were, she knew there was potential for something deeper. They had taken their time, built a foundation of trust and respect, and now, for the first time, she was open to the idea of a future with someone new. One evening, as they sat together on the porch, watching her son play in the yard, Luke turned to her with a soft smile. "I don't know what the future holds," he said, echoing her own thoughts. "But I do know that I want to be part of it, with you." She felt a warmth spread through her, not just because of his words, but because she knew that this time, it was real. There were no secrets, no lies. Just two people, choosing to be together, whatever that might look like. She didn't need to rush. She didn't need to plan every detail. For now, she was content with the way things were, stable, peaceful, and full of possibility. I had finally found the balance I'd been searching for. The past was behind me, and the future was full of potential. As she sat there, surrounded by the people she loved, she realized that the life she had built was one of resilience and grace. She had made mistakes, yes, but she had learned from them. She had fought to rebuild her world, and in doing so, she had discovered a strength she didn't know she had. The sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the yard, and she took a deep breath, savoring the moment. The past was behind her, but it had taught her everything she needed to know about who she was and who she could become. And as the future stretched out before her, full of unknowns, she smiled. For the first time in a long time, I was ready for whatever came next.